Hey everybody, this is Modern Refugee. Having my coffee this morning. I want to talk to you guys a little bit about how my mom and dad prepped when I was growing up and sort of the changes between what preparedness is today compared to what it was when I was a kid, and then even back further, how the old timers sort of handled it. Maybe I'll even dig up a picture of mom and dad in the old house in their prime, maybe with the kitchen cabinet behind them. Use that as a thumbnail for you guys, show you guys what mom and dad looked like when I was a kid growing up. Uh, there's a lot of differences between how the old timers did it and how they do it now. There's a lot of talk in the preparedness community about being, 100% self-sufficient. And none of the old timers, there was some really self-sufficient old timers, none of them were 100% self-sufficient. It was a combination of things, and I think that's the best way to look at preparedness, although that's not what you see when you watch YouTube videos and you read blogs and you go on groups and stuff, and you're reading on all that stuff. There's sort of a hard line. Oh, you got to be self-sufficient, you got to be a homesteader. The old timers used every resource that they could get their hands on, and they worked both with their communities and their towns around them, but they also worked independently. And I think that is something that is lost to a certain extent. Like my parents, when I was growing up, we had chickens, we had ducks, we had geese, we had turkeys. We had every type of fowl known to mankind when I was growing up, because that's what mom was really, really good at. But the larger animals, pork and beef, that kind of stuff, we never grew. And mom would always get that stuff from the farmer that farmed a portion of our land. So we grew stuff, but we also got stuff from the farmer. And a lot of times, like the quarter of beef that we would get twice a year, that would come off of what mom and dad had, from the farm. So the farmer would give them a quarter of beef as some of the payment for using the land. So it was stuff like that's bartering. That's your quintessential bartering, what people talk about. It's not, going to a post-apocalyptic flea market. That's how people lived when I was growing up. Then mom would always request that beef be processed in a certain way. And one of the big things that mom would always get would be soup bones. When was the last time you seen a soup bone in a meat counter somewhere? I haven't seen a soup bone in a meat counter in probably 20 years. Mom would always request soup bones because the bones were basically, nobody wanted them. So there were even times mom went to go get soup bones, and they would literally just give them to her because nobody wanted them. Mom would bring them home, put them in a pan, brown them in the oven, take them out, put them in a stock pot, throw, bay leaves and onions and stuff that we grew in there, some of her spices that she always used. She would simmer that all day. Then she would skim the top off of that or put it in the refrigerator overnight so the fat would, congeal on top. She would take that off. She would put that into quart cans, and then she would pressure can that. That was sort of how things were when I was growing up. So we would grow stuff. We had our own fruit trees growing up, and we had a huge garden. But mom would also go and get stuff from neighbors. She would get stuff from different stores that would sell large quantities of stuff, because people back then canned a lot more than they do today. Of course, in the last few years, canning has kind of come around, which is really cool to see. And there were multiple orchards around here when I was a kid growing up. Now that's kind of dwindled. There's only a couple that I can think of, but there was probably a half a dozen orchards around here growing up. So things like apples, pears, peaches was a huge one. Mom would always get peaches. We had peach trees, but then they died when I was probably 10 to 12 years old. They died. They got peach borer in them, and it killed the 3 peach trees that we had. So after that, mom would just go ahead and purchase the peaches, and then she would can them. Another thing was cherries. My dad loved canned cherries, and nobody else really did. So mom would actually get lugs. They called them lugs at the time, of cherries from Farm Bureau. And Farm Bureau is sort of an insurance company now, but it was sort of a farm advocate back when I was a kid, and a couple times a year they would get frozen fruit that would come in, and the lugs were in these metal cans that looked sort of like a 5-gallon pail with a lid on top, and they'd be frozen. And the black cherries, like what Mom would can for Dad, she would get one of those, thaw it out, and then she would can that in pint cans, so Dad would have canned cherries in throughout the winter. There was a lot of back and forth between the neighbors. If a neighbor, I remember one neighbor in particular, he had an apricot tree. He couldn't use all the apricots that came. When the apricots would come in, there was only so much apricot jam and so many apricots that could be canned off that tree that they could do. So instead of that stuff going to waste, he would give it away basically to the community. And my mom she would go over there, usually with a coffee cake or a loaf of bread or something that she made herself, to give in barter. And then we would pick apricots and bring them back for whatever Mom needed. The same thing goes for like repairs. There were different times where, things needed to be repaired, where my mom would take the mechanic's family member, because they were older, maybe take them shopping or take them to the doctor or something, and then they would fix whatever Mom needed to be fixed. There were different times when there was power outages when I was a kid. We weren't fortunate enough to have a generator when I was growing up, but there are other farmers around there did. So there were times when we would get a generator from the farmer if the power went out, so we could still run the well pump. And Mom would go ahead and bake bread for the farmer that let us use the generator for a couple of days. That's how barter worked, and that's how things worked. Everybody was independent. They worked with the community, and it was a different time. There wasn't the cutthroat nature of things like there is now. And preparedness for my parents just wasn't one thing. It just wasn't, going and buying. Now there has been changes in, preparedness technology, stuff like freeze drying and stuff like that. And I believe that the old timers eventually would have, if they would have lived long enough to see, the freeze drying and the stuff that they have now, I believe that they would have gotten on board with some of the modern technologies, because, even though the old timers had oil lamps, they still had electric lights too. So they would have got on it eventually. But there's so much emphasis on, going to the internet and purchasing things for preparedness when that just didn't exist. It didn't, people bought the tools and stuff they needed, but when they bought a tool, the mindset behind that was that tool's going to last me the rest of my life, whether it was a saw or a firearm or a tractor, whatever it was, they would purchase that stuff literally with them. I'm not going to have to buy this again. I'm going to take care of it. I'm going to maintain it, and I'm not going to have to, purchase another one. Where now it's more of a throw out thing. People buy cheap stuff, and that's when, when people talk about barter and they say, oh, put these, 10 things away that you got at the dollar store. I don't believe it would have been like that if dollar stores existed back when I was a kid. Cheap items were sort of shunned when I was growing up. You saved up to have something that was worthwhile and it would last. You didn't buy the cheapest thing just because it was cheap. Just some pointers here on, how Mom and Dad grew up. And, of course, our gardens were huge growing up. We had squash and pumpkins and potatoes and onions and parsnips and all that's rutabagas, all that stuff, kohlrabi. We had all that stuff. Cabbages were pulled up out of the ground, hung upside down in the basement. We had wooden boxes down in the basement that had slats so the air could go through, so we could put our potatoes in there that we grew, So it was basically a root cellar in the basement on top of, the wood stove. The corn crib out back had been converted over to a wood shed, again, because there were, openings in there so the air could blow through. It was a perfect place to dry firewood. So, our firewood was always stacked in the old corn crib. Just these kind of self-sufficient things that we did ourselves that, saved money, and it was just the way that we lived. But anyway, this is Modern Refugee. Appreciate all my subscribers out there. Hope you guys got a little information, a little entertainment here out of sort of my old recollections and ramblings here, talking about how my parents prepped when I was growing up. Anyway, you guys have a good one.